the smell hits you first. That particular cocktail of pepperoni grease, carpet cleaner, and the metallic tang of arcade tokens warming in small hands. It's a smell that exists nowhere else in America, a signature scent engineered not by design but by the accumulated layers of decades of operation, of spilled sodas and birthday cake ground into industrial carpeting, of pizza cheese baked and rebaked under heat lamps, of disinfectant applied liberally but never quite enough to eliminate what lies beneath. It's 1989, and somewhere in suburban America, in a strip mall anchored by a grocery store and punctuated by empty storefronts, a child is standing in front of an animatronic mouse, mouth open in wonder, eyes wide with that particular mixture of excitement and terror that only children can truly access, while behind the velvet curtain, hidden from view in the mechanical guts of the thing, gears grind and servos whine their electronic songs of programmed entertainment. The mouse's eyes are dead. Glossy black orbs that reflect the fluorescent lights overhead but hold no actual light of their own. No life, no soul, no genuine connection to the child standing before it in their best birthday outfit, clutching a paper plate sagging under the weight of 3 slices of pizza and a pile of those specific Chuck E. Cheese brand tokens that feel heavier than they should. More substantial, more valuable than mere arcade currency has any right to feel. But the child doesn't notice the deadness of those eyes. The child doesn't see the cracked latex around the jaw mechanism where years of repeated motion have created fault lines in the artificial skin. The child doesn't register the slightly off synchronization between the recorded voice emanating from speakers hidden in the walls and the mechanical mouth movements that never quite match the words. The child doesn't understand that what feels like magic is actually compressed air and pneumatic valves and servo, motors executing a programmed routine they've performed 10,000 times before. Will perform 10,000 times again until the day the maintenance budget runs out and the whole apparatus is unceremoniously powered down for the final time. The child only sees magic. Real magic. The kind of magic that transforms an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, pulled from school early for a birthday celebration, into something special, something worth remembering. Something that will be referenced years later in therapy sessions and drunken conversations with college friends. Something that becomes part of the shared mythology of growing up American in the late 20th century. The child sees a mouse that dances and sings, that knows their name when the birthday announcement plays over the sound system, that exists in that liminal space between cartoon and reality that children are uniquely capable of inhabiting without question or doubt. This is the promise of Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time, theater. A promise written in neon and delivered on greasy paper plates. A promise that childhood could be manufactured, packaged, and sold by the slice. That joy could be commodified and distributed through franchise agreements and supply chain logistics. That memories could be created on demand for $19.95 plus tax. At its peak, and we need to be very clear about what peak means in this context because peaks are defined not just by altitude but by the distance of the inevitable fall, Chuck E. Cheese wasn't just a restaurant. It wasn't just a pizza place or an arcade or an entertainment center. It was all of these things and none of these things. It was, in the truest sense of the term, a cultural institution, a rite of passage, a fever dream of American excess translated into animatronic fur and ball pit bacteria. 608 locations across North America, each one a nearly identical replica of the template, the platonic ideal of manufactured childhood joy, each one generating revenue and memories and medical claims from children who contracted mysterious illnesses from ball pits that hadn't been properly sanitized since their installation. Annual revenues approaching $1 billion, a number that meant something in the 2000s that represented the aggregated hopes and birthday wishes and parental guilt of millions of American families who had internalized the message that a proper childhood required regular pilgrimages to these temples of controlled chaos. The company had survived bankruptcy once before in the 1980s, a near-death experience that should have served as a warning, a preview of what was to come, but was instead reframed as a story of resilience, of American entrepreneurial spirit triumphing over adversity, of a brand too strong to die. When founder Nolan Bushnell's vision, that glorious combination of hubris and innovation, collided with the harsh reality of balance sheets and creditor demands and the fundamental unsustainability of rapid expansion fueled by borrowed capital, when the creditors came calling with their lawyers and their liquidation threats, it should have been the end. But it wasn't. The brand was too valuable, the concept too novel, the market too hungry for what Chuck E. Cheese represented to let it die completely. It was acquired, restructured, reborn under new management with new capital, and the same fundamental problems dressed up in different financial instruments. By the 2000s, under the stewardship of private equity, which is a polite way of saying under the control of financial engineers who viewed businesses not as ongoing enterprises with stakeholders and social responsibilities, but as assets to be optimized, leveraged, and eventually liquidated for maximum return, Chuck E. Cheese seemed unstoppable. It seemed like one of those permanent fixtures of American life, like McDonald's or Walmart, or the creeping sense of economic anxiety that defined the era. The company was an empire built on birthday parties and the quarters that funded them, on the desperation of parents looking for a few hours of peace, on the marketing genius of creating a self-reinforcing cycle where children who visited Chuck E. Cheese as kids brought their own children decades later, passing down the tradition like some kind of hereditary obligation. But empires built on nostalgia are uniquely fragile, more fragile perhaps than those built on conquest or innovation or genuine value creation. Nostalgia is a trick of memory, a selective editing of the past that removes the disappointments and the mediocrity and the faint sense of being cheated that often accompanied the actual experience. While parents lined up to relive their own childhoods through their children, projecting their edited memories onto a present that could never quite measure up. While the animatronics danced their pre-programmed routines with mechanical precision and steadily declining maintenance budgets, while the pizza ovens glowed and produced their endless stream of adequate but not actually good pizza. While the tokens clinked through the counting machines that tabulated the daily take with the precision of slot machines in Vegas, something was rotting beneath the surface. Something fundamental, something structural, something that no amount of marketing or rebranding or private equity optimization could fix. Because the problem wasn't operational, it was existential. The foundations, it turned out, were never meant to bear the weight of what was being built on top of them. The original business model, conceived in the 1970s when Nolan Bushnell was riding high on Atari success and before anyone really understood the long-term implications of mixing food service with entertainment technology, was predicated on assumptions that seemed reasonable at the time but proved catastrophically wrong over the decades. The debt was too high, accumulated through multiple rounds of leveraged buyouts and dividend recapitalizations and all the other financial engineering tricks that private equity uses to extract value while leaving the underlying business hollowed out and fragile. The model was too old, designed for an era when home entertainment meant 3 channels on a television and maybe an Atari console, before the internet and streaming and mobile devices gave children unlimited entertainment options that made a mechanical mouse singing off-key seem quaint at best, creepy at worst. The world was changing too fast, faster than a heavily leveraged restaurant chain could possibly adapt, especially when every dollar that might have gone to innovation or improvement or actually making the product better was instead diverted to interest payments and management fees and the endless demands of servicing debt that grew faster than revenue ever could. And then came 2020, the year everything broke, the year all the fragilities and vulnerabilities and structural weaknesses that had been accumulating for decades suddenly became impossible to ignore or paper over. A virus that no one saw coming, that most people couldn't even pronounce correctly in those early days, forced the doors to close. All of them, every single location. 612 Chuck E. Cheese locations representing decades of accumulated brand value and billions in real estate and equipment and franchise agreements and all the complex machinery of a modern corporate entity went dark overnight. The animatronics stopped dancing. The pizza ovens went cold. The arcade games fell silent. And the debt, that patient predator that had been circling for years, finally moved in for the kill. The entire structure collapsed like a stage set made of cardboard and broken promises, like a facade that had always been more impressive from a distance than up close, revealing in its fall the truth that had been there all along. Chuck E. Cheese had never been as strong as it appeared, had been surviving on momentum and nostalgia and the willingness of creditors to believe that next quarter would be better, that the turnaround was just around the corner, that the fundamental problems were cosmetic rather than terminal. This is the story of how Chuck E. Cheese went bankrupt. But more than that, it's the story of what happens when private capital meets childhood nostalgia, when growth becomes cancer, when the pursuit of profit transforms a pizza parlor into a financial instrument so complex that its failure was almost inevitable. It's the story of how we build temples to our own innocence and then burn them down for the insurance money. It's the story of American capitalism in miniature, all its promises and betrayals and casual cruelties compressed into the rise and fall of a restaurant chain that sold pizza and memories in roughly equal measure. Is a brand a promise or just a shell for a debt no one can pay? The question hangs in the air like the smell of old carpet cleaner, demanding an answer we're not quite ready to give. The origin story of Chuck E. Cheese begins not in a boardroom filled with corporate strategists and market research, not in the sterile, fluorescent glow of a business school case study, but in a dream, the kind of dream that only America in the 1970s could produce. That peculiar combination of ambition and naivety and absolute certainty that anything was possible if you just thought big enough, spent big enough, believed hard enough. Nolan Bushnell was riding high on the success of Atari, the company he had founded that was in the process of creating an entirely new industry, transforming video games from arcade curiosities into a billion-dollar phenomenon that would reshape entertainment and culture for generations. But Bushnell, like many successful entrepreneurs, was not content with one revolution. He had another vision, something that combined his love of entertainment, his understanding of technology, and his observation, gained from countless business trips and market research, that the pizza business was surprisingly resilient, surprisingly profitable, surprisingly resistant to the economic headwinds that destroyed other restaurant concepts with depressing regularity. The concept was simple in its audacity, elegant in its cynicism, and revolutionary in its understanding of American consumer psychology. Create a restaurant where the food was explicitly, deliberately secondary to the experience, where children were not just customers but the primary customers, the decision makers, the ones whose desires and demands would drive parental spending, where parents would pay not for nutrition, not for quality, not for any traditional marker of restaurant value, but for spectacle, for distraction, for a few hours of peace purchased at the price of mediocre pizza, and whatever small dignity remains when you're sitting in a room full of screaming children watching mechanical animals perform pop songs. It was a stroke of genius, really, if we define genius as the ability to identify and exploit a previously untapped market inefficiency. In this case, the willingness of American parents to outsource childhood entertainment to corporations who promised to deliver joy on demand. The first Pizza Time Theater opened in San Jose, California in May of 1977, right in the heart of Silicon Valley before anyone called it Silicon Valley. In an era when the future was being invented in garages and the rules for what a business could be were still being written. The centerpiece of the restaurant, the thing that made it more than just another pizza joint trying to compete in an overcrowded market, was an animatronic rat named Chuck E. Cheese, performing alongside a band of equally unsettling mechanical creatures, each one a triumph of 1970s engineering and a harbinger of the uncanny valley. Phenomenon that wouldn't be properly theorized for decades but was immediately and viscerally experienced by every parent who made eye contact with those dead, staring animatronic eyes. The rat, and this detail is important because it reveals so much about Bushnell's approach to business and life, was supposed to be a coyote. The original concept called for a coyote mascot, which made a certain kind of sense in the context of Southwestern-themed restaurants and Looney Tunes cultural references. But when Bushnell went to order the costume from a supplier, there was a mistake, or what appeared to be a mistake, though in retrospect it might have been the supplier's way of moving inventory they couldn't sell otherwise. Instead of a coyote costume, they delivered a rat suit, large and gray and utterly inappropriate for a children's restaurant given the associations rats carried in American culture, associations with disease and filth and urban decay. A normal person might have sent it and back, demanded the correct order, restarted the whole process. But Bushnell looked at that rat costume and saw opportunity. This was America, after all, where even mistakes could be monetized if you wrapped them in enough neon and novelty and sheer audacious confidence. He kept the rat, named it Chuck E. Cheese, which didn't make any particular sense but had a nice alliterative quality and a vaguely showbiz feeling, and built an entire corporate empire around a mistake that became a trademark. The concept was revolutionary in ways that extended far beyond the specific implementation details. Bushnell understood something fundamental about American consumer culture, something that economists and marketers would spend decades trying to articulate and quantify, but that he grasped intuitively. Parents would pay almost anything for a few hours of peace, for the ability to outsource the exhausting work of entertaining their children to someone else, something else, some corporate entity that promised to handle all the logistics of birthday parties and weekend entertainment. And children, bless them, would accept almost any food if it came with enough distractions, enough sensory overload, enough noise and lights and movement to overwhelm whatever primitive nutritional instincts they might possess. The pizza didn't have to be good. It just had to be there, warm and recognizable and covered in cheese, the bare minimum of acceptability that could be achieved by virtually any commercial kitchen. The arcade games, and this was perhaps the most brilliant part of the business model, were licensed from Atari, creating a vertical integration that funneled money between Bushnell's companies. They were profit centers in their own right, each machine swallowing quarters with mechanical efficiency, creating a secondary revenue stream that had nothing to do with food sales, but everything to do with the fundamental psychology of the space. The games kept children occupied, kept them away from their parents, kept them engaged in the space for longer periods of time, which meant more pizza sold, more tokens purchased, more visits extended beyond the original plan. The pizza was mediocre, but the pizza wasn't the point. The point was the experience, the memory, the photograph of your child standing next to a mechanical mouse that would outlast their childhood and probably their marriage and maybe even their life. A permanent record of a moment that felt important even if it wasn't, even if it was just another transaction in a restaurant that specialized in turning childhood into revenue. By 1981, just 4 years after that first location opened in San Jose, Pizza Time Theater had grown to over 200 locations, an expansion rate that would be considered aggressive in any industry but was particularly remarkable for a restaurant concept that required significant capital investment in animatronics and arcade equipment and custom build-outs. Bushnell took the company public, launching an IPO that valued the company at tens of millions of dollars and made him, at least on paper, spectacularly wealthy. For a moment, a brief shining moment, it seemed like he had discovered perpetual motion, a business model that printed money by transforming childhood wonder into shareholder value, that could scale infinitely as long as Americans kept having children and those children kept wanting birthday parties. And those parents kept buying into the promise that Chuck E. Cheese represented. But Bushnell had made a critical error, one of those foundational mistakes that seems invisible in the moment of success but becomes glaringly obvious in retrospect, one that would echo through the decades and ultimately contribute to the company's final collapse a generation later. He had franchised too quickly, too aggressively, with too little concern for the long-term implications of selling the dream to investors who didn't understand the operational complexity of running what was essentially a three-ring circus that also happened to serve food. The franchise model, in theory, was elegant. It was the standard American business playbook for rapid expansion, the same model that had built McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken and 1,000 other chains into household names. It spread the risk across multiple operators, accelerated growth without requiring massive capital investment from the parent company, and turned Bushnell from an operator responsible for day-to-day management into a licensor collecting fees while others dealt with the chaos of managing animatronics and pizza ovens and birthday parties, and the 1,000 daily small disasters that characterize restaurant operations. But the franchise model also created quality control nightmares that would take years to fully manifest, operational inconsistencies that damaged the brand even as they expanded it, and a ticking time bomb of misaligned incentives where franchisees cared about their individual locations while corporate cared about aggregate metrics and nobody cared about the long-term health of the brand as a whole. When a competitor named Showbiz Pizza Place emerged in 1980, offering a similar concept with better execution, more reliable animatronics, higher quality food, and tighter operational standards, the vulnerabilities in Bushnell's empire became impossible to ignore. Showbiz was backed by deeper pockets, by investors who had studied Pizza Time Theater's weaknesses and designed their concept specifically to exploit them, by operators who understood that the franchise model only worked if you maintained ironclad control over quality and experience across every location. Showbiz Pizza was everything that Pizza Time Theater should have been, everything it might have been if Bushnell had been less interested in rapid expansion and more focused on sustainable growth, if he had been willing to move slower and build stronger rather than faster and more fragile. They had better food because they invested in better ingredients and better training. They had more reliable animatronics because they didn't cheap out on maintenance and updates. They had tighter operational standards because they enforced them ruthlessly, pulling franchises from operators who didn't measure up. And they had something else, something intangible but crucial. They had learned from Pizza Time Theater's mistakes without having to pay the cost of making them themselves. By 1983, the two chains were locked in a war of attrition, spending millions on expansion while cannibalizing each other's markets in a race to see who could open more locations faster, who could dominate the market before the other one, with both companies leveraging themselves to the hilt on the assumption that whoever won the arms race would inherit the entire market, and whoever lost would disappear entirely. For Bushnell, this was existential in a way it wasn't for Showbiz. Pizza Time Theater was his baby, his vision, his legacy. He had leveraged everything on the assumption of continued growth, had taken on debt and made promises and signed contracts that only made sense in a world where Pizza Time Theater kept expanding at the rate it had been. And now, growth had stalled. Locations were underperforming. The franchise model that was supposed to be a strength was revealing itself as a weakness, with quality issues at franchised locations damaging the brand even as corporate collected fees. The company was carrying enormous debt, much of it tied to the franchise obligations and the arcade equipment leases that seemed so clever when times were good but became anchors when things turned bad. In March of 1984, Pizza Time Theater filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, a spectacular collapse that made headlines in the business press and became an instant case study in how not to scale a restaurant concept. It was the kind of failure that ends careers and reputations, that transforms founders from visionaries into cautionary tales, that gets referenced in business school classrooms for decades as an example of hubris meeting reality. Bushnell lost control of his creation, forced out by creditors and investors who saw him as the architect of disaster rather than the visionary he believed himself to be. The creditors moved in with their lawyers and their accountants, cataloging assets and determining who got paid in what order, carving up what remained of Pizza Time Theater with the cold efficiency of butchers breaking down a carcass. For most companies, for most brands, this would be the end. The doors would close, the equipment would be sold, the locations would be emptied and leased to other businesses. The animatronics would end up in warehouses or landfills. The dream would die. But the brand didn't die, and this is the first hint of something important about Chuck E. Cheese, about its peculiar resilience, its ability to survive failures that would kill other companies. In a twist that seems almost predetermined by the logic of American capitalism, Showbiz Pizza Place, the competitor that had been battering Pizza Time Theater into submission, acquired the assets in a deal brokered during the bankruptcy proceedings in 1985. It was a merger in form but an acquisition in substance, Showbiz swallowing its wounded competitor and absorbing its locations and its brand and its customer base. But then something unexpected happened, something that reveals how powerful the Chuck E. Cheese brand had become even in failure. The Showbiz name was gradually phased out over the following years, and by the early 1990s, everything was rebranded as Chuck E. Cheese's. The rat had won sort of by losing first by being so memorable and marketable and culturally embedded that even its successful competitor decided the Chuck E. Cheese name was more valuable than their own. The 1990s were a period of reinvention and consolidation for Chuck E. Cheese's, a decade-long process of rebuilding from the ashes of bankruptcy and creating something more sustainable, more professional, more aligned with the realities of the restaurant industry. Under new management brought in by the Showbiz acquisition and focused on operational excellence rather than visionary expansion, the company shed its most problematic franchises, buying back locations that were destroying the brand or simply letting franchise agreements expire without renewal. They tightened operations, implementing standardized procedures and quality controls that should have been there from the beginning. They began the slow process of rebuilding the brand's reputation, convincing parents that the bankruptcy was behind them, that the quality issues were fixed, that Chuck E. Cheese's was once again a safe and reliable destination for children's entertainment. The animatronics were upgraded with new technology and better maintenance protocols, though they remained fundamentally creepy in that way that animatronics always are. That uncanny valley quality that makes even the most sophisticated mechanical performers vaguely unsettling to anyone older than 7. The menu was refined, not improved exactly because that would require actually investing in quality ingredients and better recipes, but refined in the sense of being optimized for consistency and profitability, ensuring that every pizza tasted exactly the same regardless of location, that same baseline level of mediocrity achieved with industrial precision. The arcade games were modernized to keep pace with home gaming systems that were becoming increasingly sophisticated, replacing older Atari games with newer titles that required more tokens and generated more revenue per square foot of floor space. The brand that emerged from bankruptcy was leaner, more professional, more cynical in its understanding of what it actually sold, which was not really food or entertainment, but rather convenience and nostalgia, and the outsourcing of parental obligation. The original vision of Pizza Time Theater, with its whimsical chaos and founder-driven creativity and genuine sense of wonder at the possibilities of entertainment technology, was replaced by something more corporate, more calculated, more efficient at extracting value from nostalgia while spending as little as possible on actually delivering the promised experience. It was a more successful business model, certainly, generating predictable cash flows and steady profits. But it was also a sadder one, a fundamentally cynical enterprise that understood exactly what it was doing and did it anyway because the market demanded it and shareholders expected it, and there was no competitive pressure to be anything better than adequate. But efficiency and nostalgia make strange bedfellows, an uneasy partnership that worked for a while but contained the seeds of its own destruction. What made Chuck E. Cheese's successful in the 90s wasn't operational excellence, wasn't the modernized animatronics or the refined menu or the better management. It was demographics, pure and simple. An entire generation, the millennials, had grown up with Chuck E. Cheese's in the 80s, had their birthday parties there, had their childhood memories inextricably linked to mechanical mice and arcade tokens and mediocre pizza. And now, in the 90s and early 2000s, these millennials were having children of their own, and they wanted to recreate that experience for their kids, or rather, they wanted to recreate their edited memory of that experience. The nostalgic version stripped of the disappointments and the mediocrity and the faint sense of being cheated that often accompanied the actual visits. This created a unique market dynamic, a self-renewing customer base that required minimal marketing, because the customers marketed to themselves through memory and nostalgia and the desire to connect their children to their own childhoods. As long as millennials kept having children and those children hadn't yet discovered that the internet offered more engaging entertainment than a mechanical mouse singing off-key versions of popular songs. Chuck E. Cheese's had a built-in market. It was the perfect business model for the 90s, a time when home entertainment was limited and going out was still novel, and parents hadn't yet internalized the message that maybe outsourcing their children's entertainment to corporations wasn't the healthiest approach to family life. But it was also a fragile model, entirely dependent on demographic cycles and cultural continuity, vulnerable to any disruption that might break the intergenerational transmission of nostalgia. Private equity discovered Chuck E. Cheese's in the late 90s, and when they looked at the company, they saw something beautiful, something that made their hearts sing with the unique joy that only financial engineers can truly understand. They saw a cash-generating asset with predictable revenue streams that required minimal ongoing investment. They saw strong brand recognition that translated directly into pricing power and market share. They saw a market that renewed itself every 5 to 7 years as new cohorts of children reached birthday party age, providing built-in growth without requiring innovation or improvement. They saw real estate holdings that could be leveraged. They saw operating margins that could be increased through cost-cutting. They saw, in short, the perfect target for a leveraged buyout. A stable, profitable business that could be loaded with debt and bled for cash while still maintaining enough operational capacity to service that debt and maybe even grow a little. In 1998, Apollo Global Management acquired CEC Entertainment, the parent company of Chuck E. Cheese's, for $530 million in a deal that was financed primarily through debt, meaning they bought the company largely with money they didn't have and would need to pay back using the company's own cash flows. For Apollo, this was a classic playbook, the same strategy they had used successfully dozens of times across various industries. Buy a stable, profitable business with borrowed money. Extract maximum cash flow through dividends, management fees, and various other mechanisms that transfer value from the operating company to the private equity owners. Make some cosmetic improvements and show some top-line growth to create the illusion of value creation. Then either take it public again through an IPO or sell it to another buyer before the debt becomes unmanageable and the whole structure collapses under its own weight. The Apollo era, which would stretch across more than 15 years and fundamentally reshape what Chuck E. Cheese's was and what it could become, marked the beginning of the company's final transformation from a restaurant company into a financial instrument, from an operating business that served customers and employed workers into an asset that existed primarily to generate returns for investors. The focus shifted subtly at first, but then more obviously as the years progressed, from long-term sustainability to short-term optimization, from building value to extracting it, from investing in the business to bleeding it for every dollar that could be pulled out before the whole thing collapsed. Every aspect of the business was analyzed for efficiency gains and cost reductions. Every decision filtered through the question of whether it maximized value for Apollo, even if it damaged value for everyone else. The animatronics, which required constant maintenance and periodic updates and represented a significant ongoing expense, were gradually phased out in favor of cheaper alternatives, simpler mechanical displays that cost less to operate and didn't break down as often, but also lacked any of the charm or wonder that made the original animatronics memorable, that made them something more than just noise and movement. The menu was simplified to reduce food costs and inventory complexity, cutting out items that had low margins and focusing only on the highest profit basics, making the food selection narrower and less interesting but more profitable on a per-item basis. Labor was minimized through technological solutions and aggressive scheduling practices, using software to optimize staff levels down to the minute, ensuring that there were never more workers on the clock than absolutely necessary, even if that meant worse service and burned-out employees. The real estate, which Apollo owned through the acquisition and which represented substantial value independent of the operating business, was leveraged for additional borrowing, with the physical locations turned into collateral for ever larger debt loads, mortgaging the future for cash in the present. This is where the story becomes less about pizza and more about the mechanics of modern capitalism. Less about entertainment and more about financial engineering, less about customers and workers and franchisees and more about bondholders and interest rates and debt-to-EBITDA ratios. Under Apollo's ownership, Chuck E. Cheese's was loaded with debt, not because the business was failing or because it needed capital for expansion or investment, but because debt was the mechanism through which value was extracted. The tool through which Apollo could get its money out of the business plus returns while leaving the company itself to deal with the consequences. The company took on loans to pay dividends to Apollo, literally borrowing money to give to its owners, reducing the company's financial flexibility to increase Apollo's returns. It took on more debt to fund expansion, opening new locations not because market demand justified them, but because expansion created the illusion of growth and growth justified higher valuations. It borrowed money to finance acquisitions of smaller competitors, rolling up the family entertainment center market in deals that made Apollo's investment seem more valuable even as they loaded the combined entity with more debt. And it repeatedly refinanced existing debt at rates that assumed perpetual growth, pushing problems into the future on the assumption that future management would figure out solutions that current management couldn't or wouldn't address. By 2014, when Apollo took the company public again through an IPO that valued it at $1.3 billion and allowed Apollo to sell its stake at a substantial profit, while leaving public shareholders holding a heavily leveraged bag, Chuck E. Cheese's was carrying over $1 billion in debt, approximately equal to the entire market value of the company. Think about that for a moment. The company's obligations to creditors were as large as the company's total value. Any decline in business, any unexpected expense, any shift in market conditions would immediately push the company into distress because there was no margin for error, no buffer, no flexibility built into the capital structure. The cash generated by birthday parties and arcade tokens wasn't funding innovation or improving the customer experience or investing in the workers who made the whole thing function. It was servicing interest payments to bondholders who had lent money to Apollo, who had used that money to buy the company, and then extracted value through dividends and fees. The public markets, initially enthusiastic about the nostalgia play and the predictable cash flows and Apollo's reputation for successful private equity investments, began to sour on Chuck E. Cheese's as the 2010s progressed, and the reality of the business became harder to ignore or spin. The reasons for this souring sentiment were multiple and interconnected. A perfect storm of demographic shifts, technological disruption, and structural vulnerabilities that had been building for decades, but were now reaching a critical mass. First, birth rates were declining across developed countries, meaning fewer children entering the target demographic each year, shrinking the natural market for Chuck E. Cheese's services. Second, the rise of home entertainment options, from streaming services to gaming systems to tablets and smartphones that provided unlimited entertainment at minimal cost, meant that the value proposition of Chuck E. Cheese's, which had always depended on offering something families couldn't easily replicate at home, was eroding rapidly. Third, and perhaps most damaging to the specific business model, food delivery apps and the broader shift toward convenience and on-demand everything meant that parents no longer needed to leave their homes to access mediocre pizza. They could have mediocre pizza delivered through DoorDash or Uber Eats, could let their kids stare at iPads in the comfort and safety of their own living rooms, could achieve the same outcome, kids fed and entertained, without the hassle of driving to a Chuck E. Cheese, without the noise and chaos and stress of managing children in a public space, without the exposure to whatever germs were breeding in the ball pits and on the arcade game buttons. The entire value proposition of Chuck E. Cheese's was being undermined by technological and social changes that made staying home more attractive than going out. But the most profound challenge facing Chuck E. Cheese's, the one that couldn't be addressed through operational improvements or marketing campaigns or management changes, was something harder to quantify but impossible to ignore once you saw it. The brand had become culturally irrelevant, a relic of a different era, a joke more than a destination. The animatronics, once a marvel of entertainment technology that represented the cutting edge of what was possible, were now seen as creepy, their dead-eyed stares and jerky movements more suitable for horror films than children's parties, more likely to inspire nightmares than wonder. The aesthetic of Chuck E. Cheese's, frozen in the 1980s and 90s with its primary colors and busy patterns and sensory assault design philosophy, felt dated and overwhelming in an era that valued minimalism and authenticity and understated elegance. The entire concept, a loud, chaotic, bacteria-laden warehouse of overstimulation, clashed with contemporary parenting philosophies that emphasized mindfulness and healthy eating and screen time limits and emotional regulation. Chuck E. Cheese's had become a punchline, a reference point for everything tacky and excessive about American childhood, a symbol of parental laziness and corporate cynicism. Late-night comedians made jokes about it. Think pieces in parenting magazines explained why it represented everything wrong with modern childhood. Social media was full of stories about nightmare birthday parties and food poisoning and fights breaking out between parents in the parking lot. The brand had negative cultural momentum, a term I just made up but which captures the idea that every mention, every reference, every appearance in popular culture was making it less cool, less desirable, less aligned with how contemporary Americans wanted to see themselves and their families. The parents who brought their children to Chuck E. Cheese's did so out of obligation or lack of imagination, not genuine enthusiasm, going through the motions of recreating their own childhoods without really believing that it was a good idea. The financial markets noticed these cultural shifts before management did, or at least before management was willing to publicly acknowledge them. The stock, which had debuted at $24 per share in the 2014 IPO, was trading below $12 by 2017, a 50% decline that represented the market's assessment that the company was worth substantially less than Apollo and the underwriters had claimed. Analysts wrote reports with titles like "The Mouse That Couldn't Roar" and "Pizza and a Prayer." Dry technical documents filled with financial projections and market analysis that boiled down to a simple message. This company is in trouble. The business model is broken. The debt load is unsustainable, and there's no clear path to recovery. The company's management tried to respond with various initiatives, the kind of desperate throwing things at the wall to see what sticks approach that characterizes companies in slow-motion decline. They remodeled locations to make them more modern, ripping out the dated 80s aesthetic and replacing it with cleaner lines and neutral colors and design choices that cost millions but didn't address any fundamental problems. They introduced craft beer for parents because nothing says family entertainment like trying to upsell alcohol to stressed-out adults supervising sugar-high children. They tested new menu items, bringing in consultants and focus groups and trying to figure out what might make the food less mediocre without spending so much that it destroyed the margins. They even experimented with virtual reality stations, installing expensive VR equipment that broke constantly and required supervision, and generated minimal incremental revenue. But these were cosmetic changes, surface-level tweaks that didn't address the fundamental problem. The business model was broken, the debt load made any meaningful reinvention impossible, and the market had moved on. Every dollar spent on improvements was a dollar not available for debt service, and the creditors were watching closely, monitoring covenant compliance and cash flow trends and all the financial metrics that determine whether a company is healthy or dying. The bondholders who had lent Chuck E. Cheese's money at reasonable interest rates when times were good were now demanding higher yields to compensate for increased risk, making refinancing more expensive and further constraining the company's financial flexibility. The banks that provided revolving credit facilities were getting nervous, reducing credit limits and adding restrictions, and generally behaving like lenders do when they suspect they might not get all their money back. The whole financial structure that Apollo had built, that elegant pile of debt that had seemed so clever and profitable, was starting to creak and groan under its own weight. Behind the scenes in the warehouses and distribution centers that supplied the 600 stores, in the regional offices and corporate headquarters and franchise operations, a different story was unfolding. The human story that never makes it into the financial filings or the analyst reports, but is just as important, maybe more important, than the numbers. The workers who made Chuck E. Cheese's function, the invisible army of delivery drivers and kitchen staff and cleaners and maintenance technicians and district managers and corporate support staff, were being squeezed harder each year as management looked for ways to improve margins without actually improving the business. Labor costs, from management's perspective, sitting in their offices reviewing spreadsheets, were the easiest variable to control. You couldn't control customer demand. You couldn't control commodity prices. You couldn't control interest rates or economic conditions or demographic trends. But you could control how much you paid workers and how many workers you employed and how efficiently you deployed them. Wages were kept at or near minimum wage because why pay more when there was always someone desperate enough to accept less, always another applicant willing to take a job that barely covered rent and offered no path to advancement or security. Benefits were minimal, the bare minimum required by law, and sometimes less than that if you could structure employment to avoid triggering legal requirements for health care or retirement contributions. Scheduling was optimized through algorithms that maximized efficiency while minimizing overtime in full-time positions, creating intentionally unstable schedules that made it impossible for workers to plan their lives or hold second jobs or pursue education or do anything beyond surviving week to week. Turnover was astronomical, a revolving door of workers who lasted months or sometimes just weeks before burning out or finding something marginally better or simply giving up. But turnover was acceptable, even desirable from a certain cold financial perspective, because high turnover meant you never had to give raises or promote people or build institutional knowledge that might give workers leverage. The district managers, caught between corporate demands for cost control and impossible performance metrics, and the operational reality of running locations that depended on customer service and consistent execution, developed a kind of learned helplessness that anyone who has worked in corporate America would recognize immediately. They pushed the store managers, who had their own impossible metrics and their own fears about keeping their jobs. The store managers pushed the workers, the teenagers and college students and adults who had run out of better options, who were expected to smile and perform enthusiasm while dealing with screaming children and demanding parents and equipment that constantly broke and supplies that never arrived on time. This is the invisible machinery of American retail, the human cost that never appears in the quarterly earnings reports but is as essential to the operation as the pizza ovens themselves. When employees called in sick, genuinely sick with illnesses that would be better for everyone if they stayed home and recovered, they were pressured to come in anyway. Guilt-tripped about letting down the team and abandoning their co-workers and not being reliable, because staffing was so lean that a single absence could create operational chaos. When equipment broke, which happened constantly because maintenance budgets had been cut to improve margins, they were expected to improvise rather than wait for repairs that might not come for days or weeks or at all if the district manager decided it wasn't important enough to justify the expense. When customers complained, and they complained constantly about wait times and food quality and broken games and filthy bathrooms, the workers absorbed the abuse with fixed smiles, knowing that any pushback could cost them their jobs, that their managers and district managers and corporate didn't care about their dignity or well-being, only about avoiding complaints that might damage the brand or create legal liability. The franchisees, the independent operators who still controlled a significant portion of Chuck E. Cheese's locations, under agreements signed years or decades earlier when the brand was stronger and the business model seemed more viable, were in an even worse position than corporate employees because they had skin in the game, had invested their savings and often their entire lives' savings into a brand they believed in. They were watching helplessly as corporate decisions over which they had no control destroyed the value of their investments, eroded their equity, and pushed them toward personal financial ruin. They were required to implement costly remodels to match corporate standards, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars they didn't have on renovations that corporate said were necessary to remain part of the system, even as foot traffic declined and revenues fell and the return on investment became more and more obviously negative. They were bound by franchise agreements that locked them into purchasing supplies and equipment through corporate-approved vendors at prices that were marked up to generate revenue for corporate while destroying franchisee margins. They couldn't pivot, couldn't experiment, couldn't adapt to local market conditions or try different menu items or adjust pricing or do any of the things that independent restaurant operators could do to survive in difficult markets. All they could do was follow the corporate playbook, watch their equity erode, and hope that somehow things would turn around before they went bankrupt themselves. Many of them had personally guaranteed the loans they took out to open or buy their locations, meaning they were personally liable for debts that were becoming impossible to service as the business declined. They were trapped, unable to walk away without destroying their personal finances, unable to sell because there were no buyers for Chuck E. Cheese's franchises, unable to make enough money to pay down debt but forced to keep operating, because the alternative was immediate bankruptcy. By 2019, the situation was critical in a way that even the most optimistic analyst couldn't spin. The company was burning through cash at an alarming rate, unable to generate enough from operations to cover both the debt service and the investments needed to remain competitive. Caught in a death spiral where declining revenues meant less cash available for improvements, which meant worse customer experiences, which meant further declining revenues. Management cycled through various CEOs, each with their own vision for turning things around, each bringing consultants and new strategies and reorganization plans, each ultimately defeated by the structural realities of a business model built on debt and nostalgia that had reached the end of its natural life. There was talk of private equity coming back in, of strategic buyers who might see value that the public markets didn't, of mergers with other struggling entertainment brands that might create synergies or at least delay the inevitable by combining two declining businesses into one slightly larger declining business. But no white knight appeared. The market had moved on, and everyone in the industry knew it, even if they couldn't say it publicly. The parents who might have saved Chuck E. Cheese's by bringing their children and spending their entertainment dollars were staying home. Not because of any specific failure by Chuck E. Cheese's, but because the entire concept of going to a restaurant entertainment center had become obsolete, replaced by experiences that were cheaper and more convenient and more aligned with contemporary values. The debt that had seemed manageable when revenues were growing was now crushing, consuming cash that might have been used for adaptation or innovation or survival. The brand was toxic, carrying too much negative cultural baggage to be rehabilitated through marketing alone. The locations, many of them in dying malls, and struggling strip centers were worth less than the leases they were locked into. The equipment was outdated and expensive to maintain. The business model was broken beyond repair. Then came 2020, and with it a pandemic that would reshape American life in ways no one could have predicted, that would accelerate trends already underway and expose vulnerabilities in business models and social structures that had been hidden or ignored. On March 13, 2020, as states began implementing lockdowns and social distancing orders and Americans were told to stay home to slow the spread of a virus that was killing thousands and would ultimately kill over 1 million, Chuck E. Cheese's closed its doors, all of them. Every single location, 612 stores representing decades of accumulated brand value and billions in real estate and equipment, and all the complex machinery of a modern corporate entity went dark overnight. The lights turned off, the animatronics silenced, the pizza ovens cooling, the arcade games falling silent. The dream ending not with a bang but with a public health order. The initial hope shared by management and workers and franchisees and creditors was that the closures would be temporary, a matter of weeks at most. A brief pause before normal life resumed and customers came flooding back, eager to celebrate the birthdays they had postponed and spend the money they had saved during lockdown. Management applied for government assistance through the various pandemic relief programs, furloughed most of the workforce to reduce immediate cash burn, and tried to negotiate with landlords for rent relief and with creditors for payment deferrals. But as March turned to April and April turned to May, and it became clear that this was not a brief disruption but a fundamental reshaping of society, that restaurants and entertainment venues would be among the last businesses allowed to fully reopen, that even when they were allowed to open, they would face capacity restrictions and safety requirements that made profitable operation nearly impossible. The reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. This was not a temporary disruption that the company could weather and emerge from intact. This was an existential crisis that exposed every vulnerability, every structural weakness, every consequence of decades of financial engineering and corner-cutting and short-term thinking. The debt, approximately $1 billion spread across various tranches with different creditors and terms and covenants, was still accruing interest even though revenue had dropped to essentially zero. The landlords, themselves facing their own financial pressures from the collapse of retail and commercial real estate, wanted their rent, had their own mortgages to pay and their own creditors to satisfy. The equipment leases, the supply contracts, the franchise obligations, the insurance premiums, the utilities for buildings that sat empty, all of these continued to create cash outflows even as revenue dried up completely. The company was bleeding cash at an unsustainable rate, burning through whatever reserves it had managed to accumulate, approaching the moment when it would be unable to meet its obligations, and would have to make the choice that every distressed company eventually faces: bankruptcy or liquidation. On June 24, 2020, a date that will be remembered in business history as marking the end of an era, CEC Entertainment, the parent company of Chuck E. Cheese's, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of Texas. The filing listed between $1 billion and $10 billion in liabilities against assets valued in the same range, though the real value of those assets, primarily real estate leases and the Chuck E. Cheese's brand itself, was now deeply uncertain given that the entire business model depended on people gathering in enclosed spaces, the exact thing that public health authorities were saying people should avoid. The bankruptcy filing was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching the company's trajectory. Not to the analysts who had been predicting this outcome for years, not to the workers who had watched the decline from the inside, not to the creditors who had been preparing for this possibility. The surprise was that it had taken this long, that the edifice had remained standing as long as it did despite all the structural problems that predated the pandemic. That momentum and inertia and the willingness to kick problems down the road had sustained the company through circumstances that should have forced a reckoning years earlier. The bankruptcy was presented by management as a reorganization, not a liquidation, a temporary pause to restructure obligations and emerge stronger on the other side. Management insisted in press releases and creditor presentations and bankruptcy court filings that Chuck E. Cheese's would emerge stronger, leaner, better positioned to thrive in the post-pandemic world that was surely just around the corner. They talked about virtual birthday parties conducted over Zoom, about delivery-focused locations with minimal dining space that could produce food for third-party delivery apps, about ghost kitchens that would produce Chuck E. Cheese's pizza without the overhead of the entertainment centers, about all the buzzwords and trends and strategies that consultants were selling to every struggling retail and restaurant chain in America. These were the tactics of desperation, attempts to retrofit a business model designed for a specific moment in American culture onto a world that had moved beyond it. Attempts to salvage something from the wreckage, even if that something bore little resemblance to what Chuck E. Cheese's had been. The bankruptcy process, for those who have never experienced it either directly or through employment at a failing company, is brutal and mechanical in ways that strip away any pretense that corporations are anything other than legal fictions designed to allocate risk and organize capital. Creditors formed committees, hired lawyers and financial advisors, and began the process of dividing up what remained of Chuck E. Cheese's value according to the priority rules established in bankruptcy law. The secured creditors, those who had lent money against specific assets like real estate and equipment, were first in line, would recover most or all of their principal because they had collateral they could seize if necessary. The unsecured creditors, including vendors, owed money for supplies, franchisees owed support and refunds, former employees owed back wages and benefits, would fight over the scraps, would hire their own lawyers to argue their cases in bankruptcy court. would ultimately receive pennies on the dollar if they received anything at all. The shareholders, those public investors who had bought stock at $24 in 2014 and watched helplessly as it declined to pennies, would get nothing. Their investment completely wiped out, as is almost always the case in bankruptcy, because shareholders are last in line after all creditors are satisfied. This is the mathematics of bankruptcy, cold and precise and utterly indifferent to questions of fairness or justice or who deserved what. A system designed to maximize creditor recovery with no room for sentiment or consideration of anything beyond legal priority and asset values. For the workers, the thousands of people who had given years of their lives to Chuck E. Cheese's, who had worked for low wages under difficult conditions, who had believed or at least hoped that their employment would be stable and their efforts would be rewarded. The bankruptcy was not a legal abstraction, but a personal catastrophe that would reshape their lives. The furloughs that had been sold as temporary became permanent layoffs, pink slips delivered by email or text message, impersonal terminations of employment with the minimum legally required notice. The back wages owed to them, already modest because they had been minimum wage workers, were classified as unsecured debt in the bankruptcy proceedings, meaning they would likely never see that money, would join the long line of unsecured creditors hoping to recover something while knowing that the secured creditors would take everything of value first. Many of these workers had no savings, no backup plan, no safety net beyond what they could access through unemployment systems that were already overwhelmed by millions of other Americans who had lost their jobs in the pandemic's first wave. They had given years of their lives to Chuck E. Cheese's, had absorbed the stress and the abuse and the impossible demands, had sacrificed their time and their bodies and their dignity for wages that barely covered rent, and their reward was a bankruptcy notice and a severance package that might cover a month's expenses if they were lucky, if they were among the lucky ones who got anything at all beyond a termination email. The franchisees fared no better. Perhaps even worse because they had more to lose. Many had personally guaranteed the loans they took out to open their locations, standard practice in franchise agreements, meaning they were now personally liable for debts they had no way to repay. Debts that would follow them for years or decades, that would destroy their credit and their ability to ever start another business or buy a home or live anything resembling a normal financial life. They lost their businesses overnight, lost everything they had invested, often their entire life savings plus money borrowed from family and retirement accounts and home equity lines of credit. Some filed for personal bankruptcy themselves, joining the ranks of failed small business owners whose American dream had turned into a nightmare of debt and recrimination. Some simply disappeared, literally packed up and moved to different states under different names to escape creditors who would pursue them relentlessly for money they didn't have and would never have. The corporate entity that had sold them the dream, that had promised support and partnership and shared success, offered no assistance, no lifeline, no acknowledgement of responsibility beyond the bare minimum legal requirements. From a legal standpoint, from the perspective of corporate law and franchise agreements and the whole complex machinery of American business, the franchisees were independent businesses, separate legal entities, and their failures were their own, their problems to solve without help from corporate. This is the particular genius and cruelty of the franchise model. It allows corporations to expand using other people's capital and labor to extract fees and profits during good times, and to abandon franchisees entirely when things go wrong. Protected by the legal fiction that franchisees are independent business owners rather than exploited partners in an inherently unequal relationship. During the bankruptcy proceedings, during those months when lawyers argued and creditors positioned themselves and management tried to chart a path forward, something strange and revealing happened that exposed the cynicism at the heart of modern corporate strategy. CEC Entertainment began operating a delivery-only pizza brand called Pasquale's Pizza and Wings, using the kitchens of Chuck E. Cheese's locations that were still operational to produce pizzas that were then sold through third-party delivery apps like DoorDash and Uber Eats and Grubhub under this new name. The pizzas were identical to Chuck E. Cheese's pizzas, literally the same recipes made in the same ovens by the same workers using the same ingredients, but Pasquale's was marketed as a different brand, a separate entity, with no mention anywhere in the ordering process that this was actually Chuck E. Cheese's. This was not deceptive in a strictly legal sense because the apps did disclose the actual business address if you looked carefully enough, and there was no law against operating multiple brands from the same kitchen. But it was certainly cynical, a transparent attempt to shed the baggage of the Chuck E. Cheese's name while still extracting revenue from the same infrastructure, to trick customers who would never order from Chuck E. Cheese's into buying Chuck E. Cheese's pizza by hiding it behind a different brand. The Pasquale's experiment was revealing because it demonstrated management's clear understanding that the Chuck E. Cheese's brand had become toxic, that it carried associations so negative that even identical food sold under a different name would perform better in the market. They knew that parents would not order from Chuck E. Cheese's if given a choice, that the name itself carried associations of low quality and poor value and everything tacky about American chain restaurants, that years of cost-cutting and corner-cutting and general decline had poisoned the brand beyond redemption. But rather than confront this reality directly, rather than attempt to rebuild the brand or fundamentally rethink the business or acknowledge the damage they had done through decades of extraction and neglect, they simply created a mask, a false storefront, a corporate catfish operation behind which the same mediocre pizza could be sold to customers who didn't know any better. It was the restaurant equivalent of a con, and it worked, at least temporarily, generating enough revenue during the pandemic to keep some locations operational and give creditors hope that maybe, possibly, there was a viable path forward. By late 2020, after months of negotiations and legal maneuvering and financial analysis, a restructuring plan began to take shape, began to emerge from the chaos of competing creditor interests and management's desire to preserve something resembling the original business. The existing debt would be substantially reduced through a combination of creditor write-downs, where lenders acknowledged they would never be paid in full and agreed to accept less in exchange for maintaining some ongoing relationship with the company, and the conversion of debt to equity, where creditors exchanged their loan claims for ownership stakes in the reorganized company. New capital would be injected by a consortium of lenders who saw value in the brand and the real estate, even if the business model needed substantial revision, who believed that post-pandemic there would still be a market for family entertainment centers, even if that market was smaller and more challenging than it had been. Most of the locations would remain open, though the least profitable, those in dying malls and struggling markets and places where the demographics had shifted away from families with young children, would be closed permanently, their leases terminated or transferred, their equipment sold or scrapped, their workers laid off without severance. The animatronics, those creepy mechanical performers that had defined Chuck E. Cheese's for decades, that represented both the innovation of the original concept and the dated quality that had become a liability, would be removed from most locations, unceremoniously stripped out and replaced by dance floors and digital entertainment, and other cheaper alternatives that didn't require constant maintenance. The new Chuck E. Cheese's would be sleeker, more modern, more aligned with contemporary tastes and contemporary parenting philosophies. It would also be smaller, humbler, aware of its diminished place in the cultural landscape, no longer claiming to be an essential part of childhood, but rather just another option among many. The company emerged from bankruptcy in December 2020, technically intact but fundamentally transformed, alive in a legal sense but bearing little resemblance to what it had been. The debt had been reduced from $1 billion to roughly $500 million. Still substantial, still constraining, still a burden that would limit operational flexibility and strategic options. But at least theoretically manageable under optimistic projections that assumed pandemic recovery and steady growth and operational improvements that might or might not materialize. About 50 locations had been permanently closed, but the remaining 560 locations were preparing to reopen as pandemic restrictions eased, as vaccines became available, as some version of normal life seemed possible again. The workforce, of course, was almost entirely different from the pre-pandemic employee base. Most of the workers who had been furloughed in March 2020 were never called back, their positions eliminated or filled by new hires willing to work for the same low wages under the same difficult conditions. Maybe even worse conditions, given that post-pandemic staffing shortages meant working even more short-handed, covering even more positions, dealing with even more stressed customers. The institutional knowledge, the relationships between workers and managers, the informal systems and workarounds that make any organization function effectively beyond what appears in official procedures. All of that had been lost, wiped out by the combination of bankruptcy and pandemic and the massive turnover that had always characterized Chuck E. Cheese, but had accelerated to the point where essentially nothing remained of the pre-bankruptcy organization except the brand and the locations and the debt. What remained was a brand name, a collection of real estate and equipment, a mountain of reduced but still substantial debt, and a business model that had been exposed as fundamentally broken but had not been replaced with anything better, only with cheaper versions of the same basic concept. The post-bankruptcy Chuck E. Cheese's faced a market that had been permanently altered by the pandemic, by the forced experimentation with different ways of living that lockdowns had created, by the revelation that many things people thought were necessary were actually optional, were actually not missed when they were gone. Parents who had discovered during lockdown that they didn't actually miss taking their children to Chuck E. Cheese's, that birthday parties at home or in parks were actually preferable to the chaos and expense and stress of the restaurant, were not rushing back now that restrictions were lifting. The birthday party industry itself had been disrupted, with many families opting for smaller, more intimate gatherings rather than the large, impersonal celebrations that Chuck E. Cheese's specialized in, discovering that maybe it was actually better to celebrate with close friends and family rather than inviting entire classrooms of children whose parents you barely knew. To a corporate entertainment center, inflation was driving up food costs, making the already marginal pizza operation even less profitable, forcing choices between raising prices and destroying value perception, or absorbing costs and destroying margins. Labor shortages driven by workers reevaluating their relationships with low-wage work and finding better options or leaving the workforce entirely meant that even the low wages Chuck E. Cheese's offered were insufficient to attract workers, forcing many locations to operate with skeleton crews that couldn't deliver acceptable service, that made the customer experience even worse than it had been, that created a vicious cycle of bad service leading to bad reviews, leading to fewer customers, leading to less money for wages, leading to more turnover. But the most profound change was cultural, was in the collective American consciousness about what mattered and what didn't, about how to spend time and money, about what kind of childhood to create for the next generation. The pandemic had forced a collective reckoning with values and priorities, had created space for questioning assumptions that had seemed unchangeable, had revealed that many things marketed as essential were actually just profitable for corporations. The old model of outsourcing childhood entertainment to corporations, of buying experiences rather than creating them, of accepting mediocrity wrapped in nostalgia and marketed through emotional manipulation. That model had been revealed as hollow, as unsatisfying, as something that served corporate interests more than family interests. Parents were looking for something different now, looking for authenticity in a world of manufactured experiences, for quality in a market flooded with adequate, for experiences that meant something beyond the transaction. Chuck E. Cheese's built on the opposite philosophy, built on the idea that everything could be commodified and monetized and reduced to a transaction. Had nothing to offer this new market, no way to adapt its fundamental DNA to align with what families now said they wanted. The investors who had funded the bankruptcy emergence were not sentimental about these cultural shifts, not concerned about whether Chuck E. Cheese's aligned with contemporary values or parenting philosophies. They had done the math, run the models, consulted with advisors and analysts, and concluded that there was still value to be extracted from Chuck E. Cheese's even in its diminished state, even serving a smaller market, even operating with lower margins. The real estate, particularly in suburban locations with captive markets where families had limited entertainment options, could generate steady returns through lease payments or eventual sales. The brand, while damaged and carrying negative associations, still had recognition value that could be leveraged, still had some residual nostalgia among the millennial generation that was still having children, still represented something in the American cultural imagination, even if that something was increasingly negative. The ghost kitchen model, producing Chuck E. Cheese's and Pasquale's pizzas for delivery through third-party apps, could operate with minimal overhead and scale to meet whatever demand existed without requiring the full cost structure of operating entertainment centers. The traditional dining rooms, the entertainment centers, the experience that had defined Chuck E. Cheese's for decades, these were being phased out not because management wanted to, not as part of some strategic vision, but because they had no choice. Because the market had rendered them obsolete. Because the costs of operating them exceeded the revenue they could generate. Throughout 2021 and 2022, as the pandemic slowly receded and American life attempted to return to something resembling normal, Chuck E. Cheese's stumbled forward in a kind of corporate zombie state, neither fully dying nor truly recovering, existing in a liminal space between failure and survival. Some locations did well, particularly in areas where families were desperate for any form of out-of-home entertainment after months of lockdown, where parents had reached their limit with their children and needed somewhere, anywhere to take them for a few hours. Others struggled, barely breaking even, hemorrhaging cash, kept open only because closing them would trigger lease penalties or signal broader problems to creditors who were watching nervously to see if their bet on the company's recovery would pay off. The company experimented with various concepts, throwing ideas against the wall to see what might stick, trying to find some formula that would make the business work in this new environment. Smaller footprint locations in shopping centers that required less capital investment and could serve more targeted markets. Partnerships with trampoline parks and other entertainment venues trying to piggyback on concepts that seemed to be working better. Subscription programs that promised discounts and perks to frequent visitors, trying to create recurring revenue and customer loyalty. Digital integration, apps and screens and technology overlays that were supposed to make the experience more modern and engaging. None of these initiatives gained meaningful traction, generated meaningful returns, solved any fundamental problems. They were tactics without strategy, desperate attempts to find product-market fit for a product the market no longer wanted in a form the company could profitably deliver. The workers, those who remained through the bankruptcy and the pandemic and the restructuring and all the chaos that had characterized the company for years, adapted to the new reality with the resignation that comes from having limited options and needing to survive. The job was still difficult, still low-paying, still fundamentally exploitative in the way that most low-wage service work in America is exploitative, extracting maximum labor for minimum compensation while offering no security or advancement or dignity. But it was a job, And in a precarious economy where jobs were scarce and competition was fierce and many people had been unemployed for months or years, that counted for something. They learned to do more with less, to cover multiple roles, to accept that the company's promises of stability and advancement were lies, but necessary lies, the kind you tell yourself to get through the shift, to make it to the next paycheck, to survive another week. They watched as management cycled through new initiatives and buzzwords and consultant-driven strategies as new CEOs came in with fresh energy and departed months later when they realized the problems were unfixable, as the fundamental issues that made Chuck E. Cheese's broken were never addressed because addressing them would require acknowledging that the entire business model was predicated on extraction rather than creation, on maximizing short-term cash flow rather than building long-term value, on treating workers and customers and franchisees as resources to be exploited rather than stakeholders to be served. The franchisees who survived the bankruptcy, those who managed to hold on to their locations despite the losses and the betrayal and the complete abandonment by corporate, became a strange kind of zombie entrepreneur, trapped in a business that was failing in slow motion but unable to escape. They had sunk costs they couldn't recover, investments of time and money and hope that were gone forever, but that kept them anchored to a sinking ship. They had obligations they couldn't escape, franchise agreements and lease terms and loan covenants that bound them legally and financially to Chuck E. Cheese's even as the brand destroyed whatever value remained. They had business models that were failing but not failing fast enough to justify walking away, generating just enough revenue to cover immediate expenses while slowly consuming whatever equity remained. Some tried to sell, spent months or years looking for buyers who might take the business off their hands even at a massive loss. But there were no buyers for Chuck E. Cheese's franchises in 2021. No one foolish or desperate or optimistic enough to think that owning a Chuck E. Cheese's location was a good investment. Some tried to rebrand, to create their own concepts using the physical assets they controlled, to escape the Chuck E. Cheese's brand and all its negative associations and build something new. But the franchise agreements made this difficult and risky, contained provisions that prevented franchisees from operating competing businesses or using knowledge and systems developed as part of the franchise relationship, created legal and financial obstacles that made independence nearly impossible. Most just kept going, kept showing up every day to run businesses that were destroying them financially and emotionally and physically, hoping that things would improve, that the next year would be better, that the investment of their lives and their savings would someday be worth something again, that loyalty and persistence and willingness to endure would eventually be rewarded. This is the particular cruelty of sunk costs, the psychological trap that keeps people trapped in failing enterprises long after rational analysis would dictate walking away, cutting losses, starting over. The story of Chuck E. Cheese's decline is often told as a story about disruption, about technology and changing consumer preferences, and the inevitable obsolescence of old business models in the face of innovation and progress. And those factors are real and important and deserve attention. But they're not the whole story, not even the most important part. The real story of Chuck E. Cheese's is about how private equity transformed a restaurant chain into a financial instrument, how debt was used as a tool of extraction rather than investment, how short-term thinking and perverse incentives destroyed long-term value that might otherwise have been preserved or adapted. Chuck E. Cheese's didn't fail because the pizza was bad or because kids preferred iPads to animatronics, though both of those things were true and contributed to the decline. Chuck E. Cheese's failed because it was loaded with so much debt that it had no flexibility, no resources to adapt, no ability to weather the inevitable downturns that all businesses face. It failed because private equity extracted value faster than the business could create it. because Apollo took hundreds of millions out of the company through dividends and fees while leaving behind a hollowed-out shell that collapsed at the first sign of stress. It failed because the franchise model that was supposed to spread risk and accelerate growth instead created quality problems and operational inconsistencies. And a system where corporate profited while franchisees bore all the risk and absorbed all the losses. It failed because every decision was made to maximize short-term metrics that determined bonuses and valuations, rather than build the kind of sustainable business that could adapt to changing market conditions. This is the paradox at the heart of modern American capitalism, the fundamental contradiction that becomes more apparent with each passing year. The tools that are supposed to allocate capital efficiently and drive innovation, that are supposed to make businesses more productive and valuable, are often used instead to extract value and create fragility, to enrich a small number of investors and executives while destroying value for everyone else. Private equity, in theory, provides patient capital and operational expertise to underperforming businesses, helping them reach their potential through better management and strategic investment. In practice, at least in the case of Chuck E. Cheese's and many others like it, private equity loads companies with unsustainable debt, extracts cash through dividends and fees that have nothing to do with operational performance, and leaves behind fragile shells that collapse at the first sign of stress. The beneficiaries of this system are the investors and the executives who collect their fees and bonuses regardless of long-term outcomes. The victims are the workers who lose their jobs, the franchisees who lose their investments, the communities that lose gathering spaces and employment centers, and the customers who end up with worse products at higher prices. Consider what Chuck E. Cheese's might have been if it had not been burdened with $1 billion in debt that served no purpose except enriching Apollo. It might have invested in actually good food and ingredients and recipes and kitchen equipment that could produce something better than adequate, attracting customers based on quality rather than nostalgia or convenience or lack of alternatives. It might have created a genuinely innovative entertainment concept that gave children experiences they couldn't get at home, that made coming to Chuck E. Cheese's something special rather than something tolerated. It might have paid its workers enough to reduce turnover and build expertise and create the kind of institutional knowledge and customer service that makes businesses successful. It might have supported its franchisees through difficult transitions rather than treating them as revenue sources to be exploited and abandoned when convenient. It might have entered the pandemic with cash reserves and financial flexibility that allowed it to survive the closures without bankruptcy, to emerge stronger rather than weaker. None of these counterfactuals are guaranteed, and it's possible that Chuck E. Cheese's would have failed anyway, that the fundamental changes in how families spend time and money would have made the business model obsolete regardless of debt levels or management decisions. But the debt made all of these possibilities for adaptation impossible. The debt was not a tool for growth or investment or building value. It was a mechanism for extraction, for transferring value from the operating company to the private equity owners, for maximizing returns to Apollo while leaving everyone else to deal with the consequences. The bankruptcy of Chuck E. Cheese's in 2020 was not the tragic end of a beloved American institution brought down by forces beyond its control. The tragedy happened much earlier, in the late 90s and 2000s, when the company was financialized, when it was transformed from an operating business with stakeholders and responsibilities into an asset to be strip-mined for shareholder value. The bankruptcy was just the inevitable conclusion of a process that had been underway for decades, the moment when the unsustainability of the debt load and the extraction could no longer be hidden or delayed. And the emergence from bankruptcy was not a resurrection or a rebirth, not a return to health or sustainability, but a final harvesting, a last attempt to squeeze whatever value remained before the market rendered the entire concept irrelevant and the whole structure collapsed completely. In the years since the bankruptcy, Chuck E. Cheese's has become a case study in business schools across America. Filed under categories like failed turnarounds and the limits of nostalgia, and private equity value destruction. MBA students analyze the decisions that led to the collapse, debate what management should have done differently, write papers arguing that the company should have embraced digital transformation sooner or focused on the core pizza business or never taken on so much debt in the first place. These analyses are not wrong in their specific observations and recommendations, but they miss something essential about what actually happened and why it matters. They treat Chuck E. Cheese's as a business problem with business solutions, as a case where better strategy or better execution or better timing might have produced a different outcome, when in reality it was a systemic problem that required systemic solutions that were never on the table, that would have required fundamentally rethinking how we allow private equity to operate, how we regulate financial engineering, how we protect workers and franchisees and communities from the worst excesses of short-term thinking. The communities that lost their Chuck E. Cheese's locations during the bankruptcy, the towns and suburbs where locations closed and never reopened, experienced a peculiar kind of loss that doesn't fit into easy narratives about economic change or creative destruction. These were not beloved institutions in the traditional sense that churches or libraries or historic landmarks are beloved. Few people genuinely mourned the closure of their local Chuck E. Cheese's, cried real tears over the loss, felt like something irreplaceable had been taken from them. But the locations had served a function, however imperfectly, as gathering spaces for families, as venues for celebrations, as employers providing jobs to thousands of local workers, as anchors for strip malls that were already struggling. When they closed, they left behind empty retail boxes in dying commercial districts, adding to the growing landscape of American commercial decline, contributing to the visual evidence of economic failure that characterizes so many American communities. Some of these spaces were eventually filled by other businesses, discount stores or gyms or medical offices that repurposed the distinctive Chuck E. Cheese's layouts for new uses. Many remain empty years later. Monuments to a particular vision of capitalism that built too quickly, leveraged too heavily, and collapsed when the economic tide went out. The animatronics, those creepy mechanical performers that had terrified and delighted generations of children, that had been the defining feature of Chuck E. Cheese's for decades, met various fates after the bankruptcy and the subsequent location closures and redesigns. Some were sold to collectors and enthusiasts who saw them as artifacts of 20th century American culture, who paid surprising amounts of money for worn-out mechanical mice and birds and other creatures that no longer worked, but represented something about a particular moment in entertainment history. Some were scrapped for parts, broken down into components that might be useful for repairs at remaining locations, or sold to museums or simply discarded as industrial waste. Some ended up in storage facilities in warehouses full of obsolete equipment and failed dreams, waiting for a market that will probably never materialize, for someone to decide they have value beyond nostalgia or curiosity. There's a certain poetic justice in this dispersal and abandonment of the animatronics. They were built to be eternal, to provide consistent entertainment across decades and generations, to be the permanent fixtures around which the business model was constructed. They were supposed to outlast everything else, to be the one constant in a changing world, the mechanical performers who never aged or changed or needed replacing. But they turned out to be as disposable as everything else in American consumer culture, discarded when they were no longer profitable, when maintaining them cost more than replacing them with cheaper alternatives, when the aesthetic they represented became a liability rather than an asset. They were built to last, but abandoned when lasting became economically irrational. Just like the workers who were laid off without severance and the franchisees who lost everything and the communities that lost gathering spaces. Nolan, Bushnell, the founder who started it all in 1977 with a vision and a rat costume and absolute certainty that he could transform family entertainment, has watched this long decline from a distance, from the comfortable remove of someone who got out early and made his money and bears no legal responsibility for what came after. He lost control of the company in the 1980s bankruptcy and has had no operational role since then, though he retained enough stock through various iterations to make him modestly wealthy when Apollo took the company public in 2014. In interviews over the years, the few times he has been asked about Chuck E. Cheese's rather than about Atari or his other ventures, he expresses a kind of bemused detachment, acknowledging the problems with the animatronics and the pizza while defending the core concept of Pizza Time Theater as genuinely innovative for its time. He's right about the innovation, about the original vision, being something new and creative and different. But innovation without sustainability is just a more elaborate way of failing, just a longer path to the same destination. Bushnell's vision was real and revolutionary, transformed how people thought about family entertainment and restaurant concepts and the commercialization of childhood. But it was also fragile, entirely dependent on a specific moment in American culture when parents trusted corporations to shape their children's experiences and when debt was cheap enough to fund rapid expansion without immediate consequences. That moment passed, and the vision that had seemed so durable turned out to be as temporary as everything else, as subject to the forces of market change and cultural evolution and the inevitable obsolescence that awaits every business model eventually. The current iteration of Chuck E. Cheese's, the post-bankruptcy entity operating under new ownership and with reduced debt and revised strategies, is attempting to chart a course between acknowledging the past and escaping it, between honoring the legacy and admitting that the legacy has become a burden. The marketing emphasizes new Chuck E. Cheese's with clean modern locations that bear little resemblance to the chaotic entertainment warehouses of previous decades, with contemporary design aesthetics and updated equipment and all the visual signals that say this is different, this is better, this is not your childhood Chuck E. Cheese's. The pizza, they insist in advertising and press releases, has been reformulated and improved, developed with input from consultants and focus groups, designed to meet contemporary standards of quality and taste. Though objective reviews and taste tests suggest otherwise, suggest that it's still mediocre pizza dressed up with better marketing. The entertainment has been updated to include more interactive digital games and fewer animatronics. Recognizing that the mechanical performers who were once the brand's signature have become its liability, that children raised on smartphones and tablets expect different kinds of engagement than pneumatic valves and recorded songs can provide. The entire brand positioning is trying to say, without saying it explicitly enough to alienate the few remaining customers who still have positive associations with the old Chuck E. Cheese's. We know what we were. We know that wasn't working. We're something different now. Please trust us again. But trust, once broken as thoroughly as Chuck E. Cheese's broke it, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild, especially when the breaking was so public and the betrayal so complete. The parents who might give Chuck E. Cheese's another chance, who might be convinced that the changes are real and meaningful, remember too much. They remember the closures and the bankruptcy and the stories about ghost kitchens selling rebranded pizza to customers who didn't know they were really buying from Chuck E. Cheese's. They remember the general sense that the company was more interested in extracting money than delivering value, that every decision was made to benefit investors and executives rather than customers and workers. They remember bringing their own children to Chuck E. Cheese's in the 2000s and 2010s and feeling underwhelmed, disappointed by how the reality failed to match their memories, by how obvious it was that corners were being cut and quality was being sacrificed for profit. They remember the workers who were laid off without severance, the franchisees who lost everything, the creditors who are still fighting years later for whatever scraps remain. This is not the foundation on which successful brands are rebuilt, not the context in which trust can be restored or loyalty can be earned. The essential question about Chuck E. Cheese's, the question that transcends this specific company and speaks to broader issues in American capitalism and corporate governance and how we structure our economy, is this: what is a brand actually worth? In accounting terms, in the frameworks that MBA students learn and analysts use, brands are valued based on their ability to generate future cash flows, calculated through discounted cash flow models that project revenues and profits years into the future, and then discount them back to present value using various assumptions about risk and growth. Chuck E. Cheese's, at various points in its history, was valued at over $1 billion based on these calculations, based on analysts' and investors' beliefs about what the brand could generate. But those calculations assumed continuity, assumed that the past would predict the future, assumed that brands built on nostalgia would continue to benefit from that nostalgia as new generations reached the target demographic and repeated the patterns of their parents. They didn't account for the possibility that nostalgia could curdle into embarrassment, that brand recognition could become brand stigma, that the memories parents associated with Chuck E. Cheese's were memories they wanted to escape rather than recreate. In a deeper sense, brands are promises, implicit contracts between companies and consumers about what to expect, what values are being sold alongside the products. Chuck E. Cheese's promised fun and affordability and convenience, promised that bringing your children here would create positive memories and fulfill parental obligations and provide value that justified the cost. For a long time, perhaps a decade or two, when the concept was new and the execution was adequate and competitors were limited, it delivered on those promises, however imperfectly. But when private equity took over, when the debt load became unsustainable, when cost-cutting and corner-cutting became standard operating procedure and every decision was made to maximize extractable value rather than customer satisfaction, the promise was broken. The fun became forced and hollow, manufactured rather than genuine. The affordability disappeared as prices increased while quality declined. The convenience was negated by understaffing and poor service and the general sense that you were being taken advantage of rather than served. What remained was just the shell of a brand, a logo and a mascot and a collection of locations, all of it propped up by debt and momentum until neither could sustain it any longer. The workers at Chuck E. Cheese's, those invisible souls who made the pizza and cleaned the ball pits and repaired the arcade games and dealt with drunk parents and out-of-control children and absorbed abuse that no one should have to endure for minimum wage, they understood this better than anyone, understood the gap between the promise and the reality, between what the brand claimed to be and what it actually was. They saw how the company valued profits over people, how every decision was made to maximize short-term cash flow at the expense of long-term sustainability and worker welfare. They saw the promises made to customers matched by promises broken to employees, the marketing about family values and creating memories existing alongside labor practices that showed zero regard for worker dignity or well-being. They knew the business was failing long before the bankruptcy, could feel it in the declining foot traffic and the deferred maintenance and the increasingly desperate cost-cutting measures that made their jobs harder while saving pennies. But they had no power to change anything, no voice in the decisions being made in distant corporate offices by people who had never worked a shift on the floor, no stake in the outcomes beyond their next paycheck, which barely covered rent and certainly didn't create any financial security. They were just labor, a line item on a balance sheet, expendable and interchangeable in the cruel calculus of modern capitalism. This is the human cost of financial engineering, the cost that, never appears in the quarterly reports or the bankruptcy filings or the business school case studies, but is perhaps the most important part of the story. When Chuck E. Cheese's filed for bankruptcy in June 2020, it eliminated over 10,000 jobs. 10,000 people who suddenly found themselves unemployed in the middle of a pandemic when unemployment was already at depression era levels, and finding new work was nearly impossible. 10,000 people, many of them living paycheck to paycheck with no savings or safety net, many of them supporting families and paying rent and dealing with the accumulated stress of poverty and precarious employment. Many of them with few better options in an economy that had been decimated by pandemic shutdowns and showed no signs of quick recovery. All of them discarded because the financial structure of the company had become unsustainable, because the debt service demanded by creditors exceeded what the business could generate, because private equity had extracted so much value that nothing remained when crisis came. Some found other jobs eventually, usually at similar or lower wages in similarly exploitative conditions, joining the ranks of essential workers who kept society functioning during the pandemic while being paid poverty wages and receiving no protection or appreciation. Some left the workforce entirely, unable or unwilling to continue accepting the terms of low-wage service work, surviving on unemployment benefits and savings and help from family and friends until those ran out, and harder choices had to be made. Some ended up homeless or dependent on emergency aid, falling through the cracks of a safety net that has been systematically dismantled over decades, becoming part of the visible evidence of American economic failure that litters our cities and haunts our collective conscience when we allow ourselves to notice. Their stories are not part of the official narrative of Chuck E. Cheese's decline, not included in the bankruptcy filings or the analyst reports or the business school case studies. But they are the most important part, the part that reveals what's actually at stake when companies fail, when business models collapse, when financial engineering creates fragility that leaves workers and their families to absorb the costs of failure.